Our special program reviewing the day's discussions at the World Economic Forum for Africa, WEF today. Please stay with us.
Hello and welcome to WEF today, that program that puts together a summary of all that has happened at the, not at the World, at the just concluded World Economic Forum on Africa. It ended today and it was a fantastic one. I am Nelta Igbe.
And I'm Harriet Agbeni. Thank you so much for joining us.
Now, it was a big action conference, yes, some will say. Big conversations, multiple conversations from different angles, all looking at a spectrum of things, from ICT to agriculture to all of that. And there were a lot of expectations. At the end of the day, one would say, or as the managing director of the World Economic Forum put it, they were able to achieve so much in such a short time.
Very true. The meetings were done in such a way that it would allow everybody participate. It was a multi-stakeholder meeting, something that everybody knew that they had a stake in, whether you're from the public sector, from the private sector, civil organization, or even the youths. Everybody was actually, called to action. Let's take this journey to a different level. We started a transformative journey for Africa. Africa is rising. African economy is growing. But we want to take it forward. And so key sectors that can actually drive this, this growth was highlighted. And the conversations have been that, yes, we can do it, but we need to begin to build our infrastructure to make sure that we achieve this. And how can we build our infrastructure is if we come together and realize that we need to have this hands-on approach.
Yeah.
Everybody, it's not an individual thing, but everybody should come together and let's work together.
No, it was more like what we were talking about yesterday. Today was like a cementing of what was discussed yesterday about that aspect of believing in the continent, more like believing in the continent, believing in ourselves. Now, with growth, global recovery after the depression of some years back, global recovery, different economies are picking up. The African economy is considered one of the most viable in the next few years right now, and by 2020 the African economy is believed to be likely to be one of the leading economies, so to speak, at the rate it's going. So an inclusive growth is required. One of the things, the managing director of the World Economic Forum brought out 3 pillars. He talked about building community, for purpose, building community for interest, and building community for action. So that bit of the action is what a lot of Africans and indeed Nigerians will be looking at, that part of the actions, because they'll tell you, we've heard all this talk about purpose, we've heard all this talk about interest. What we want to see is the action part.
Now, talking about the action, most of the conversation that, I listened to, all of them were saying the same thing. Let's have a regional integration in terms of trade. Let's have improved intra-trade. Let's have the ease of, that challenge of moving goods, services, and people across the borders. Create facilities that will help not just the youth, but also women. Because, the youth and the women constitute a very large population. The youth actually constitute about 60% of Africa's population. And so when you create funds for this population, for this huge army, you're creating a massive investment. And I can't really find that word now to quantify it, but we're actually moving. We're moving forward, and we're moving with resolve. Not as if we're taking steps anymore. We're tired of taking steps. From all the conversations heard here, we're tired of taking steps. We want to move with resolve. Now, if progress is actually going to be, I mentioned it already, we have to make that progress, African leaders have to make that progress in infrastructure. Power is critical. Roads are critical. Railways. Things that will make the ease of doing business
a lot easier.
And when you begin to address, those, for instance, those issues, definitely Africa will pick up.
Okay, well, we were not the only ones. The Channels team was here as the host broadcasters, handling the whole, covering this entire event. But Harriet and I were not the only ones that had our own view of this country. I believe Bolaji Akinwale, our correspondent, also had her own
Well, she put together a report, because, the 24th edition of the World Economic Forum has ended, and as I said, the leaders have actually resolved to take a bold, decisive step to transform the continent. Now, from what was discussed at most of these conversations was that the fact that about $68 billion is expected to be invested in Africa in the next couple of years. Now, part of this money is expected to fund key sectors, including agriculture, manufacturing, industrial services sector, and of course education, energy, and the health sector.
Yeah, well, let's listen to our correspondent report, Bolaji Akinwale, the report she put together about the World Economic Forum on Africa.
And final day of the World Economic Forum on Africa was a basket of ideas. These range from the importance of achieving the Millennium Development Goals to having sustainable and renewable energy. The United Nations has stated that education and improved healthcare delivery must be paramount on the agenda of African leaders if they must attain the MDGs.
So, to kickstart this viewpoint, Nigeria's Minister of Finance, Dr. Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, was unequivocal on the growth that can only be driven by these two factors.
For me, I think education is crucial. I want to agree with His Excellency, the President of Senegal, on that, and with you on your observation, because really, if you educate girls and women, then you take care of a whole lot of problems. One area I'd like to highlight and be more critical where we are failing is on maternal mortality. Why do I say that? I say that because that's where we really do have answers to that. We know what to do. We have the technology to make sure that women do not die in childbirth. And yet, we have very high maternal mortality numbers.
Education combined with health is really important to do that. But I will say that in the sector in which we are less competitive, we have some problem, is the question of unemployment and poverty. We have to work harder on it.
Yeah. In addition to that, African leaders are advised to provide the right environment for growth to thrive.
The main thing that needs to happen is obviously good governance, institutions functioning, peace, rule of law, access to, respect and dignity of the individual, as I call it. These are the fundamentals, and there are enormous opportunities, but they're fundamentals for business as much as for governments, because they're fundamentals of society. And then the second thing I would ask is, as we develop this growth, because this continent is growing very fast, be sure it's done in a sustainable way. We have the opportunity to design the growth here in the future and not make the mistakes that have been made in many parts of the world.
Turning to sustainable energy on the continent, the Minister of Petroleum Resources, Mrs. Desiani Alison Madueke, sets the ball rolling on how Nigeria and indeed Africa can achieve this feat.
We have become Africa's largest producer in terms of oil and gas. Unfortunately, how that is parlayed into actual, real engagement of the polity all the way down the spectrum is a different issue altogether. I think for too long, Africa's middle class has had a squeeze. So you actually begin to have the wealthy and, of course, the poor, to put it in the best way possible. I think the work ahead of us now is to ensure that the output of these resources is adequately and efficiently, not to mention expediently, deployed all the way across the spectrum.
One of the key problems I think we have on the continent is subsidies. The subsidies that go into petroleum resources is, to be honest with you, in my opinion, is ridiculous. And I'll say this, you take a country like Nigeria, we spend $10 billion subsidizing petrol. Right. Now, it's the cost of building a railway system across the country every single year. It's the cost of building 2 refineries every single year.
The World Economic Forum on Africa may be over. However, what may continue on a more robust scale is the implementation of ideas, findings from this year's meeting, and a better lifestyle for the people on the continent. Bolaji Akinwale for Channels Television News.
Okay, now that focus, what you put together, all that we're talking about, advancing or accelerating development in Africa.
Africa's development.
How can that be achieved? I mean, the coordinating minister of Nigerian economy, also Okonjo-Iweala, talked about the fact that we have the parameters on ground, not just in each of the countries, and indeed the entire country has the parameters on ground, and is able to accelerate this quickly. But there's another aspect that was brought in, the area of energy.
Engaging in energy, that's right. And then the energy deficit in Africa is quite huge. And from what the conversation was, it seems that 600 million people across the continent are without energy for domestic use. Now, that's really, really high. And so, to begin to address this, the government of African countries need to be proactive. You know, the energy investors need to know that they can go ahead with their plans. And so more and more we're getting this call, this very strong call for the private investor, you know, to ride this out, as it were, to take up this challenge, and let us begin to see more productivity. Like they said, let them be more proactive in how they decide to put in their investment and how they decide to begin to provide. Because, you know, like I mentioned already when we started this conversation, it is very important that people have electricity, they have power to do their business. And if you don't have power, if you don't have gas to even cook your food, then it becomes a major issue.
You know, when you started, you said government of African countries, and I was like, oh, I thought you were going to say government of Africa. Indeed, it's government of Africa. But besides having power, electricity, and all of that, the aspect of financing also comes in, because in engaging with energy, there's need for financing.
True.
And I think the financial institutions really have to step in and do something about this.
Yes, like the group managing director and CEO of UBA, Mr. Philip Odoza, actually says the bank, that's UBA, will play a huge role to achieve inclusive growth and create jobs. And it's not just going to be in, you know, specific sectors, it's going to be spread all across the board.
As a major player in this region, is very, very optimistic about Africa. And a whole lot of things that have been discussed in this particular forum, you know, center around inclusive growth, center around financing, whether it is consumer financing, SME financing, infrastructure financing, and so on and so forth. UBA is a very key player, and we also play in these segments. We believe that with this particular forum, a lot of things, you know, have been brought to limelight, and we are very, very optimistic. As you know, the privatization of the power sector in Nigeria, which occurred last year, UBA played a very, very major role. As a matter of fact, we financed to the tune of about $700 million the successful bidders, both at the GENCO side and at the DISCO side. For us, electricity, it is a very, very important aspect of our business. And I'll tell you the opportunities that exist. Now, Africa has a population of about 1 billion people, and about 60% of the electricity that is generated in the whole of Africa is generated by just two countries, South Africa and Egypt. And these two countries constitute about 12% of the population, which means that there is ample room for growth in that particular segment. And for us, we have identified with President Obama's Power Africa, and we have keyed into it. We are financing, you know, that sector because we believe strongly in that. Electricity, power will make that difference as far as Africa is concerned. UBA has always been a player in the agri sector. As a matter of fact, our loan portfolio is made up of about 7% coming from agri, and this is above the industry average in Nigeria. So agri for us is very, very key, and we are financing the entire value chain of agriculture. And I give you an example. Now, look at Africa. Africa constitutes about 60% of the uncultivated arable land in the world, and we believe that there is a lot of opportunity for that. That notwithstanding, the cultivated land, the yield is one of the least in the globe. So we see significant opportunities, improved seedling, improved the technology, towards agri coming into Africa and so on. And because of the fact that Africa has the raw materials, because a whole lot of the agri, crops actually grow in Africa, we have very good climate. We believe that agro-allied industries should actually spring up from Africa, because they can actually backward integrate into that particular sector using the raw materials that we have, the agri inputs. And again, we have the workforce labor is available here, and then the consumer market is very, very big. In fact, the forecast is that by 2020, consumption in Africa will be about $1.4 trillion. This is
Welcome back. We'll take a break, and when we return, we'll have a guest in the studio who will help us analyze the entire conference, how feasible the recommendations that have been made, and how can we move forward from here.
Please join us again.